Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Jason Allen here, the Concrete Pipe Guy. I'm the Technical Resource Engineer for Oldcastle Infrastructure, and I'll be presenting today's webinar. And our topic is antitrust law and trade associations, and we'll probably throw a little bit in there about baseball as well. So before we begin, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a proud graduate of the University of Utah with bachelor's and master's degrees in water resources and civil engineering. I've been in the engineering industry for over 20 years now. Started out right out of high school as a surveyor, and then became a drafter and designer, worked in land development, both in residential and commercial sites. Took a job in the public sector as a county engineer, and then later as a public works director. Went back into consulting and did roadway and drainage design work for large municipal and DOT projects. And then I got involved in marketing engineering and technical resource engineering through the Mountain States Concrete Pipe Association, and now for Oldcastle. So some people may not know what we do at Oldcastle, and you may not be familiar with our product line. So just wanted to share with you some of the things that we do. So as I mentioned before, I live in Utah. I represent the Utah and Idaho area here for Oldcastle. And if you're in that area, you probably know us by some of our main products that we provide. Reinforced concrete pipe being one of them. Precast box culverts is another. Catch basins, manholes, those things. But there are some other really cool products that we've recently acquired and added into our repertoire so that we can help provide additional solutions for engineers, inspectors, contractors in our area. So our newest addition in the Utah market is gasketed box culverts. Instead of your typical soil-type massive joints, we now have the ability to manufacture gasketed box culverts, which have a watertight joint, and we don't have to have any additional joint treatment to make them watertight. This actually saves quite a bit of time and money in installation, so it's a great option for box culvert installation. We've also expanded our stormwater solutions to include storm capture. This is a total stormwater management system. It uses precast sections for underground detention storage, and it uses the strength of reinforced concrete to provide more area for storage. This drastically reduces the footprint compared to other underground detention options that you might see on the market. And we also have a lot of stormwater treatment options like sediment traps, debris basins, hydrodynamic separators, a lot of different things that can fit your specific needs and stormwater treatment requirements. So as I mentioned before, today's topic will be focused on antitrust and trade associations. Now, during this time of year, we tend to have a lot of conferences for different associations in our area, including like the American Public Works Association, Utah City Engineers Association, the Utah Floodplain and Stormwater Management Association, just to name a few. So additionally, many of us at Oldcastle, we like to get involved, and we try to get involved on some of these associations, whether by serving on their boards or various committees and different things. So I thought it would be a really good idea to have a little refresher course on antitrust law and what we should watch out for as we participate to improve the engineering, construction, and infrastructure industries through our involvement with these associations. So some of the key takeaways for today's webinar will be, we're going to talk about the antitrust laws, we're going to talk about trade restraints, and then we'll see how we can apply these into our lives. So when we look at trade associations, basically the main functions of trade associations are to set industry standards, to provide education, improve efficiency, and to promote technological advances. Now, one example of a trade association that I'm very familiar with and that we at Oldcastle are familiar with would be that of the Mountain States Concrete Pipe Association. Now, as I mentioned before, I was the director of the Mountain States Concrete Pipe Association. I did that for about 6 years. The Mountain States Concrete Pipe Association had some member companies that manufactured reinforced concrete pipe, namely Oldcastle Infrastructure and one of our competitors, Geneva Pipe and Precast. And so those were the two main pipe suppliers and manufacturers in Utah and Idaho. And so that was who our membership was. But we also had a lot of other members, associate members, for instance, Ash Grove and Wholesome. Now, these are both cement manufacturers. They are competitors, just like Oldcastle and Geneva Pipe and Precast are competitors. But Oldcastle and Geneva both buy their cement from each of these companies. And so it's a really interesting dynamic with this association. Now, one thing that I was always told as I was the director of this was it was really remarkable to see all of these competitors coming together to promote the industry. And I think it brings a lot of credibility when you have direct competitors that are looking to improve the industry, and they're willing to put aside their differences and come together to help the industry be better. And I think a lot of the engineers that I met with and spoke to, and a lot of the contractors, a lot of the inspectors that I met with and talked about, they were really, really impressed by this, that we would come together and do this. And so when we would share different standards and different things with them, they tended to listen because it had a lot more credibility, because we were all coming together under the banner of the Mountain States Concrete Pipe Association. So trade associations can have a very positive impact on setting those industry standards. So some of the antitrust laws that we're going to talk about today there's 4 of them: the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, the Robinson-Patman Act, and the Federal Trade Commission Act. So let's start with the Sherman Act. Now, whenever I hear Sherman, I think of my two favorite Shermans. Number one, the Sherman M4 tank, great tank that was used in World War II to fight off the Nazis. Great tank. I could talk about that for hours, but unfortunately, we're not going to talk about that. The other Sherman would be obviously Mr. Peabody and Sherman, one of my favorite cartoons growing up, and a great movie years later that I like watching with my kids. Anyways, unfortunately, we're not going to talk about those. Let's focus on the Sherman Act. It's just as riveting and exciting as either a Sherman M4 tank or watching Mr. Peabody and Sherman. So there's 2 different sections of this act. Section number 1 prohibits basically trade. It talks about trade restraints, and it prohibits every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade. Now, by their very nature, right, trade associations are basically a combination of competitors. So one element of a possible antitrust violation is already present, and that is basically when competitors are meeting together. Now, there really needs to be only some action by the association that illegally restrains trade for there to be an antitrust violation. So just competitors meeting together doesn't necessarily say there's an antitrust violation, but if an association is doing something that illegally restrains trade, then that could be a violation. Okay, so that's what Section 1 talks about. Now, Section 2 talks about monopolies. And monopolies could apply to a trade association if the association has the power to set standards for that industry. Section 2, any claims made under Section 2 can also include claims of, say, unfair membership, if there's different criteria for membership that are different across the board depending on the company, any disciplinary rules that are unfair or inconsistent across the board, any allegations of illegal group boycott or denying admission or causing expulsion from membership, the denial of certain membership benefits deemed vital to remain competitive within that industry. So there's a lot of different things that associations can fall under this section of the Sherman Act if they're acting in ways that restrict other companies from being part of that industry.
Yes, I get $2,000. Pay me $2,000. I hate this. What the heck? You're supposed to pay me $2,000. I didn't want to pay. I only had $5. It was either that or go bankrupt.
I mean, let's be honest. If you're playing Monopoly and somebody doesn't throw a board across the room, I mean, are you really playing Monopoly? I mean, come on. Okay, so the Clayton Act. This is the second of the antitrust laws that we're going to talk about today. The Clayton Act basically prohibits exclusive dealing agreements. All right. So, for example, let's say there's a manhole cover manufacturer that wants to agree to deal with us only if we agree not to carry any products of their competitors. So, as you can see, an arrangement like this could be very powerful, and it could result in a significant portion of the market being closed off to any other competitors. So the unlawful restraint of trade in this example is the loss of choice to our consumers, and it could result in the higher prices of this manhole cover company that they could charge because they've basically eliminated all their competition because we won't carry any of their competitors' products. So it also prohibits mergers and acquisitions where the sole purpose is to lessen competition. Now, we see mergers and acquisitions happen all the time. In fact, we see it pretty regularly in our industry. Recently, one of the bigger pipe and precast manufacturers in the country acquired another very large pipe and precast manufacturer. And it, in some markets where they acquired them and there wasn't going to be sufficient competition, the Clayton Act requires that some of those plants be sold to other companies so that it doesn't completely remove competition, because once competition's gone in the market, it can have an adverse impact on consumers, because if there's nobody to compete with, we can just hike up the prices, and it could cause some major problems to consumers. And so this Clayton Act tries to protect that as much as possible. There's now the Robinson-Patman Act. This deals with vampires that glimmer in the sunlight. It's all about love stories about vampires. It was very popular among teenage girls in the early 2000s. And now that I say it, I realize I think I've got this one mixed up with Robert Pattinson. So yeah, that's right. I apologize. That's on me. Robert Pattinson. That's obviously the star of the acclaimed vampire saga Twilight, that I know is definitely one of my favorite movie series of all time. And arguably the greatest vampire saga of all time. So anyways, that's Robert Pattinson. That's different from Robinson-Patman. So Robinson-Patman Act is all about price discrimination among buyers. So this prohibits a seller of goods from discriminating in price between different buyers when that discrimination may have an adverse effect on competition. And it applies only to the sale of products, not services or intangibles. So here's an example. So let's say like Wonder Bread, right, was selling to two different grocery store chains, and they decided to charge Kroger a different price than another grocery store. So they'll say, okay, Kroger, we're going to sell it to you for a lot cheaper than we sell these other people, because Kroger could come to them and go, oh yeah, we want this different price, and this has happened in different times. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, if the price is different, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a violation. Now, let's say one of the companies says, oh, we want you to sell it to us cheaper because we want people to come and buy your product from us and not from those other stores. Now, that is an antitrust violation. However, it could mean that, like, let's say Kroger says, all right, we're going to have you deliver to our warehouse, and then we'll distribute it to stores instead of delivering your Wonder Bread products to every single individual store. Now, in a case like that, Kroger could prove that there's there's a lot more efficiencies, and it's justified to have a different price. So just because we're selling products to different competitors at different prices doesn't necessarily mean there is an antitrust violation. If there's a justified reason for those different prices that we're selling them to, then we're in the clear. But if we're doing it in a way to hurt competition, then that would be a violation of the RPA. Now, it is interesting to note that in the example above that I talked about there with Wonder Bread and Kroger, it would likely benefit the consumers with cheaper bread prices, right? Yet the conduct could still be considered unlawful if they're doing it to try to suppress competition. This is really the only antitrust act that doesn't have the protection of consumers via lower prices or increased choice as its essential goal. It was passed during the Great Depression, and it was done so to try to ensure that mom and pop shops had a better chance of competing with these new, bigger chain stores. And for this reason, the Robinson-Patman Act really doesn't get much respect from legal scholars. While it is still on the books, however, we still have to ensure its compliance. Lastly, there's the Federal Trade Commission Act. The Federal Trade Commission Act prohibits unfair methods of competition in or affecting commerce and unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. It actually has very broad powers, and the scope of this act really encompasses the Sherman, the Clayton, and the Robinson-Patman Act. So it encompasses all three of those. All right, let's talk about some Federal Trade Commission Act's case studies. These are some pretty fascinating ones. The first one was U-Haul and Avis Budget Group. U-Haul and Avis they got together. They decided to talk about what they should charge for truck rentals. So they were actually found guilty of colluding on prices for truck rentals. So that's price fixing. You can't do that. Another one was the National Association of Music Merchants. So this is an association that had an issue there. So they basically, what happened was the National Association of Music Merchants is a trade association. It has almost 9,000 members nationwide, and they found that they violated federal law by encouraging the exchange of competitively sensitive price information among its members. Now, the Federal Trade Commission alleged that NAMM organized meetings where its members were encouraged to communicate and did in fact share information about prices and business strategy. Now, this was to the detriment of consumers. NAM's conduct enhanced the members' ability to coordinate price increases for musical instruments. And in settling the complaint, the National Association of Music Merchants agreed to stop engaging in such conduct. It was an interesting one because this is one of from the finding of the courts that trade associations provide many services for their members, but enabling competing sellers to work together to coordinate higher prices is not a legitimate function of a trade association. So that's kind of fascinating and interesting to know there. So let's talk about antitrust violations. All right, this is the important part here. There's a couple of different ones. There's standard violations. Now, for standard violations, the anti-competitive effects must be proven. So we have to show that there are anti-competitive effects from our actions for a standard violation. Now, there's another violation called per se violations. Now, the doctrine of per se illegality states that there's really these are violations that are so blatantly harmful to competition that the court will presume that they're illegal without having to prove any harm at all. So with a per se violation, all the government needs to prove a Section 1 violation is to show that the defendant engaged in the unlawful practice. It doesn't matter what the defendant's motives were or if there were any observable anti-competitive effects. Okay, like an example of a per se violation would be like price fixing or market and customer allocation discussion. So if there's any of that, they don't have to show that there's any anti-competitive effects. If you're price fixing, you're guilty. It doesn't matter what happened. It doesn't matter if it was to the benefit of the consumer or to the benefit of the company. If you're price fixing, that is a per se violation. You don't have to show the anti-competitive effects. And then the last one is called rule of reason. And so every agreement that affects trade will in some regard also restrain trade, right? Because if you think about it, every contract that you have, it forecloses another opportunity, right? So the key is whether the restraint is reasonable versus unreasonable. All right. So there's really no clear line that defines what unreasonable is. However, the U.S. Supreme Court suggests that the trial courts review information about the relevant business, its condition before and after the restraint was imposed, and the restraint's history, nature, and effect. So those are just some things that you want to look at when you're dealing with these antitrust violations there. So now that we talked about the violations, let's talk about the penalties. The first one, obviously, is criminal prosecution is very possible. There's also a possibility of fines up to $1 million per individual. Now, in antitrust violations, you can be held personally liable for these, right? So it isn't just you can't use your corporate immunity for this. If you are found guilty of this, you could be fined personally up to $1 million. Additionally, a company can be fined up to $100 million, and individuals who are guilty of this can serve up to 10 years in prison. And then on top of that, there's also civil remedies, and that can be up to triple the actual damages. It includes attorney's fees, injunctive relief, etc. So these antitrust violations are very serious, very severe, and the penalties really show just how seriously the federal government takes these antitrust violations. All right, so let's talk restraints of trade. There's two different types of restraints of trade. There's horizontal restraints, and then there's vertical restraints. All right, so when we talk horizontal versus vertical restraints, these are definitely not the types of restraints we're talking about. We're definitely not talking about that. That's a different conversation for a different time. Okay, so horizontal and vertical restraints. I'm going to show this chart here, and if you look at it, we've got the 1, the 2, and the 3. So if you look at that 1 row there, you've got manufacturer, manufacturer, manufacturer. That would be considered horizontal along that line, right? So either manufacturer to manufacturer, distributor to distributor, but vertical would be going up and down on that. So if you have a restraint of trade between manufacturer and distributor, all right? So basically, a horizontal restraint is an agreement formed by two competitors that restrains trade. So examples of this would be price fixing, division of markets or customer allocation, rigging of bids, or what's called a concerted refusal to deal. Another word for this would be a group boycott, right? So a group boycott basically occurs when a group of competitors agree to not to purchase or do business with a specific company or companies in order to drive them out of business or coerce them into taking a certain action. So, for instance, let's say we want to get a member to join our association, and they say, no, we don't want to do that. We don't see the value of it. And so some of the manufacturers in there say, well, fine, we're not going to buy your products unless you join our association. That is a violation. That's a group boycott. That is a horizontal restraint, because the manufacturers got together, right? It's all in that same row. They got together and said, okay, fine. If you're not going to join our association, then we're not going to buy from you. That is illegal. That is an antitrust violation, and it's considered a horizontal restraint. Now, a vertical restraint would be an agreement between vendors and customers. So either between the manufacturers, the distributors, or the distributors and the consumers. But this is another example of this would be price fixing, exclusive selling agreements like we talked about earlier, any territorial or customer restrictions, or exclusive dealing agreements. So those are all examples of vertical restraint. So the question then becomes, what can an association do, right? We're a member of all these associations, and now we see all these restrictions that are possible, but what can they do? What is the main focus behind them? Now, first and foremost, lobbying, right? They can lobby for their industry. And the second would be setting standards for their industry. So we'll take these one by one. Let's focus on lobbying first. Now, there is the Noor-Pennington Doctrine, and this basically protects businesses and other associations when they join to petition legislative bodies, administrative bodies, or courts for actions having anti-competitive consequences. So this doctrine, however, does not protect the incidental use of lobbying if the real goal is to harm our competitors. So it only does it if we're basically as long as trade associations are acting in good faith, then the Noor-Pennington Doctrine provides the foundation on which trade associations can petition their government to promote their products over their competitors, right? So if we're showing that we're doing that we're just trying to promote our industry and help have better, safer, a higher quality product there, a higher quality installation, different things, those are okay to do. It's protected by Noor-Pennington, because we know those are going to have anti-competitive effects, but we're protected by the NPD on that. But we've got to act in good faith. We just can't have it as our main goal being trying to squash our competitors and hurt them. So there's that one. Now, standard setting is basically industry standards. They provide consumers important information and ensure that products are manufactured to the highest safety standards, and they're the highest quality. They're compatible with related products. They're efficiently manufactured and can thereby reduce costs. Now, a standard that has a high level of quality is likely to be considered beneficial to society, and thus it would be legal. Now, one example of this that we found, a real life example that we had here when I was the director of Mountain States Concrete Pipe Association, there was a company that was manufacturing box culverts, and they were, I'll just say, for lack of a better word, loosely interpreting one section of a national specification. And because of a perfect storm of events that happened, where with some changeover with some personnel at a municipality, and contracting with a consultant, and some other changes of personnel, some different things, the shop drawings were approved when they maybe shouldn't have been, and they ended up installing this box culvert that maybe did not meet what we considered it didn't meet the standards of safety and quality for that product. And so we got together and wrote a specification that cities could adopt that would basically protect them in the future, and it would provide a safer product and a higher quality product. And so any cities that wanted to use this standard were allowed to. They were welcome to. And as they did that, this basically clarified the section that was ambiguous, the one little section, and it just put it in writing. And then cities had the option to elect to use it or not. And if they chose to use it, then it would be these products would be built to this higher safety and quality standard. And we think that's a huge benefit to society. So that was allowed as the Mountain States Concrete Pipe Association promoted this standard and helped to improve our industry. So there's a couple of case studies that are kind of fascinating that I wanted to talk about. And the first one is the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, or ASME, versus the Hydro Level Corporation. This was a court case in 1982. It was a United States Supreme Court case. And it was one where, for the first time, a nonprofit association was held liable for treble damages under the Sherman Antitrust Act due to the antitrust violations. Basically, what happened, well, the court did find that a nonprofit association is liable when it fails to prevent antitrust violation through the misuse of the association's reputation by its agents, and that includes lower level staff and unpaid volunteers. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, a lot of us sit on these committees, like a specification committee or the board of directors, and we're just volunteers. We're unpaid volunteers on these associations. But this court case was the first one where they found this nonprofit association would be held liable, and including those unpaid volunteers. Now, basically what happened was this. In 1971, the engineering firm of McDonald and Miller requested an interpretation from the ASME Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code from the committee over the boiler and pressure vessel codes for ASME. Now, McDonald and Miller, they planned to use this response to show that one of their competitors, who happened to be Hydro Level Corporation, they wanted to prove that they were selling a device that wasn't not compliant with the ASME code. Okay, so unknown to ASME's leadership, the chairman, who was a volunteer, the chairman of this committee, wrote a response to McDonald and Miller's inquiry, and McDonald and Miller later used this letter. Their salesman used this letter as proof that Hydro Level was non-compliant. And subsequently, according to Hydro Level, this was the reason that it never acquired sufficient market penetration to sustain their business, and they eventually went bankrupt. So Hydro Level ended up suing McDonald and Miller, the Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company, and the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, arguing that two ASME subcommittee members acted not only in the self-interest of their companies, but also in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So they were found guilty. Allied Tube and Conduit Corp versus Indian Head Incorporated. Allied Tube was a manufacturer of steel conduit, and they were successful in defeating a vote to approve a competitor's plastic conduit as being safe for use in electrical wiring and they did this by basically packing a meeting of the National Fire Protection Association with newly recruited members. The Supreme Court, when they reviewed this, they held that the Noor-Pennington Doctrine that we talked about earlier, that protects for lobbying, it did not protect the steel conduit manufacturer from liability under the antitrust laws, because the manufacturer's intent was to harm the competitor, not to promote the high industry standard. So this practice of packing the meeting to defeat the standard was considered to be unprotected commercial activity. So kind of a fascinating case study there as well. Another one with involving that kind of hits close to home for me, at least, is NSPE versus United States in 1978. This is the National Society of Professional Engineers. In the NSPE, they have a canon of ethics, and prior to 1978, they had a provision in there regarding prices. And basically, what this provision was is it said it prohibited engineers from quoting prices until they were hired. So they said, well, we think that this is a rule of reason to protect public interest. And what they were worried about was that engineers might understate costs in order to win a project, and this could severely affect public safety. So NSPE was acting in good faith. They wanted to protect the public. But you can see from that, with not allowing, if they say professional engineers are not allowed to quote prices until after you hire us, you could kind of see how that could be an issue for consumers. It could have anti-competitive effects. You could then price hike and charge a lot more than others. So yeah, there are some issues with this one here. Basically, what was found in 1978 was an opinion by Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens. He found that it wasn't considered price fixing. Okay, that's the number one finding that they found. All right, but he also said that no elaborate industry analysis is required to demonstrate the anti-competitive character of such an agreement. Right. So as a result, because even though it wasn't price fixing per se, he did still show that he said that based on the antitrust laws, this is still anti-competitive in nature. And as a result, the provision of the canon of ethics was nullified. This was ruled by a lower court, and it was later upheld by the Supreme Court. So that provision to the canon of ethics for the National Society of Professional Engineers has since been removed and replaced with another provision. Okay, so there are a few exemptions to antitrust liability. So a couple of those that I wanted to share are, number one, state action immunity is one of those that's an exemption. So basically, this allows certain state and local government activity to avoid antitrust scrutiny, such as, I mean, if you think about it here, like bidding, right? When you have like a bid tab and you make it available to the public, there are certain things that governments have to make available to the public because it's public record. But in doing so and showing what contractors and other consultants and things are charging, that could cause some issues with price fixing and different things in the future. But because they have to share this stuff because it's public record, it basically has some immunity there for those types of things. So they're able to share those with the public upon demand. Market participant regulations like utility providers are also kind of considered into this as well. Now, filed rate doctrine, this deals with like regulatory rates that are filed with the Federal Administrative Agency. So this includes industries like energy, shipping, insurance, where they have to file their rates with the federal government. Those rates, because they're public knowledge, that again could have anti-competitive impacts, but this is an exemption because they're required by the federal government to also release those prices and things to them. Insurance companies, for instance, they're exempt from antitrust liability because of the nature of their business. Labor exemptions like unions, those types of organizations, associations are also exempt to antitrust liability. And my absolute favorite one, my favorite exemption to antitrust liability, because it just is absolutely fascinating to me, is baseball. Baseball is exempt from antitrust liability. It is actually the only major professional sport that is exempt from antitrust liability. It's kind of fascinating. The story is really fascinating. It's long, and I'm not going to get into all the details here, but just a couple of highlights here that you can that were really interesting to me, and I thought I'd share with you as well. Was back in 1879, the newly formed National League in Major League Baseball exercised what was called a reserve clause, and the whole purpose of this was they wanted some of their players to stay with their organizations for their whole career. And so they got together as teams and they agreed that they would have exercise this quote reserve clause that would hold or basically reserve 5 players on their roster that were not eligible to trade in the future, or wouldn't go anywhere. These would be their kind of franchise players or marquee players that would stay with their organizations for their whole career. Now, started out okay. I guess that's a good enough idea. But what happened was eventually they found that these were so successful that and they were so beneficial to the club owners that they expanded it to the entire 14-man roster on each of the teams. And so what these teams were doing is they were reserving all of their players so that they weren't eligible for contract negotiations or trading or anything like that. So it became kind of a problem for the players. And this led to what's called the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players being created in 1887. And that was basically the first players union that protected the interests and the rights of the players. So they ended up suing the National League. They beat the reserve clause in 1890 for that season because of some technicalities. However, the reserve clause stayed intact in baseball for 80 more years. So kind of fascinating there. There was another federal court case that was called the Federal Baseball Club versus the National League. This was in 1922. And this was where there was a finding from the Supreme Court that said that antitrust laws do not apply to professional baseball. In 1953, there was another court case called Toolson versus New York Yankees. This invoked the Commerce Clause of the Sherman Act, and it eventually led to free agency in Major League Baseball. So kind of a fascinating story on how free agency came to be so that they could protect the interests of the players for Major League Baseball, but it still to this day has an exemption from antitrust liability. So it's the only professional sport to have that. So yay baseball, I guess. I don't know, whatever. All right, so when we talk about antitrust and we get together with companies and our competitors and different things, there's a few topics that we really ought to avoid. All right, and if you ever get into an association meeting and you get talking about these things, you really need to step back and stop and say, whoa, this is not a good conversation to be having. Stop it, remove yourself, and inform everyone that this is not appropriate to be talking about. Number one, current or future prices and past prices, for that matter. Just don't talk about prices. If you're ever with a competitor, don't talk about prices. All right. Increases or decreases in price. Again, talking about prices, if it has to do with price, stay away from it. Right. Profit level. That's another one. Hey, what's your profit on this product? Hey, what are you guys seeing in your profit level on this one here? Yeah. Don't talk about that. That is, that can be considered price fixing. And as I mentioned earlier, that would be a per se violation where you don't need to show any anti-competitive effects. If you're price fixing, if you're caught for that, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. All right, including standardizing and stabilizing prices, procedures, or policies for setting price. Right, we, by our very nature, we want to know kind of what our competitors are doing, and sometimes we can harmlessly just talk to them about certain things like, hey, how do you determine your price? Do you do it by materials and labor? Do you just have a set fee, like a fixed sum? How do you do that? By asking that question, you are opening yourself up to severe antitrust violations. So just if you're in a room with competitors, just don't talk about it, right? Just stay away from it. Don't talk about it. All right. Some other things, discount credit terms, allocating markets. This is a big one where it's when I was the Mountain State Association director, I would get phone calls from people and they would say, oh, I have a question about this project. What would it cost for this? And because I don't know what the prices were, because I was the director of the association, I wasn't allowed to know because that would be an antitrust violation. I would recommend that they call one of the companies that I was representing. So I would say, oh, you can call so-and-so with company A or so-and-so with company B. And the reason I did that was because I didn't want there to be any view or look that I was favoring one company or another, or I was allocating markets, or I was saying, oh well, you're in this area, that would be company B, why don't you give them a call? Or oh, you're up in this area, oh, that's company A's market. Yeah, that's not allowed. That's not okay with with associations, or when you're dealing with competitors, just talking about, hey, why don't you guys take north of this line, we'll take south of that. That is a huge antitrust violation. So that's what allocating markets is, and it's a problem. So definitely don't discuss that. Your views on a competitor's prices. It could just be as simple as and innocuous as saying, yeah, I feel like our, you guys are a lot higher than us. Just, you know what, don't even talk about that. Just let's do our best. Let's focus on us and do that. Refusal to deal with a corporation because of its pricing or distribution practices, right? We talked about it earlier of saying, well, if you're not going to do X, Y, and Z, then we're not going to use you, and we're going to encourage our competitors not to use you, and Yeah, those types of things, those are definite antitrust violations. We don't want to talk about those at all. Okay, so those are just a few topics to avoid. Some of the major ones that could really get you into trouble. There's obviously a litany of other topics that could get you into trouble, but those are the main ones when we get into these associations with our competitors. Those are some things that can come up that could really get us down a bad path there. All right, so let's talk about some real world applications here. I've got a couple of different examples that I wanted to kind of walk through and talk about so that we could see how it applies, how this antitrust thing applies to us and the associations that we're involved in. The first one is competitive bidding versus direct select. So the question that I've been asked is, why are entities allowed to direct select consultants or contractors, right? And how is this different from that NSPE decision, right? If you remember, when we go back to the National Society of Professional Engineers decision, the canon was saying that we couldn't provide prices before we couldn't provide our prices until after we were selected. So some people say, well, I've had a project where I was direct selected to do it, and I didn't have to bid against anybody else. They just selected me to do the work. We see that quite often with UDOT, for instance. They'll just direct select on a small project and give it to someone that they want to work with there. Other municipalities do that sometimes too. And really what it comes down to is, and sometimes if you're not familiar with the process and how that works, then that would look like, wow, how is that not an antitrust violation? How is that any different from the National Society of Professional Engineers? It comes down to qualifications and pools. So UDOT, for example, let's use that one. When I was back doing work as a consultant engineer, I would get selected all the time, just a direct select to work on a small project. And I would, they would call me and say, hey, can you do this project? I would say yes. And they would just send me a contract and we'd get going on it. Now, the reason they were able to do that is because every 3 years they would have me submit, in the firm that I was working for, they would have us submit a statement of qualifications that showed that we were qualified to do this type of work. They also had checks and balances on pricing. So they would, as part of that qualification pool, is that they would, and me being on that pool, the company that I was working for being on that pool, is that we had to disclose our financial documents as well, what we were charging for specific services. So it wasn't as cut and dried as, oh, we're going to choose this engineer and then we'll find out what they're charging before. We would have, every 3 years, we would have to get back re-upped on this pool and this qualification based on our qualifications, so that we could prove that, yes, we can do this work. And once they have a pool of qualified engineers and consultants, they could choose any of them, because all of those engineers, all those engineering companies, those designs, whether it's inspection or design or surveying or whatever it was, they found that they were qualified to do the work, and that their what they were charging was within their limits of what was acceptable or not. So there were some controls into place there. So that's generally where you why that's not a violation there, is because some of these cities or the states have these pools based on statements, qualifications that they've reviewed and approved. So that's where with contractors is a little bit different, right? Because they're just price based. And so if they don't have a pool of qualified contractors that they can use with prices already identified and established, then you go through the competitive bidding process. So that's the difference there, where sometimes for design services, you'll get direct select, versus construction services, it would be going through a competitive bid. All right. The next one would be, we'll just talk about restricting commerce. So question was asked to me, can an entity restrict a company's ability to do business based on past performance. So the question would be, what is the entity? Is the entity like a city, for instance? Can a city restrict a company's ability to do business based on past performance? So if we had a bad experience with a contractor, let's say I'm working for the city and I had a really bad experience with a contractor, can I decide to not choose them in the future based on an experience I had with them? And the answer is absolutely, I can. If I know that they made some mistakes and I have justifiable proof that they don't do quality of work and they've got issues there, and now companies change, maybe they had a bad project, I can always change that and say, well, I've decided that they've made significant changes since then. We're going to use them now. But when we're talking about restricting them and not allowing them to even bid or rejecting their bid, even if they're the low bid, we're able to do that based on past projects. So it's always important on these projects. If you're the contractor, make sure you've got references that are going to give you a good recommendation. If you're the city that's looking to hire these people or the state that's looking to hire them, make sure you're checking the references. Make sure you go through some of the past projects and check with them and see what you can do. As far as the city, what can and should you say if someone calls you? Let's say we had a project one time that I did when I was representing a municipality, and we got the bids come in, and the low bid was significantly lower than what we had anticipated it would cost based on our engineer's estimate. And we were nervous. We were really nervous about this. We were like, man, I've never worked with this company before. I'd never heard of them. This bid is low. I don't understand how they're that much lower than the company who owns the asphalt batch plant. Like, how are they that much lower and that much cheaper? And so I called a bunch of references to see what they said, and they all had glowing recommendations. They said, man, if we could just choose them every project without going through the bid process, we would. They are such a great company to work with. They do amazing work. And all 5 of the references that I called had the same story, the same thing. And I thought, wow, what a great thing. We ended up hiring them. I met with the company. They explained to me how they were so much less than the other companies. And we ended up hiring them and had a fantastic project. They did a great job. Now, for every one of those stories, there's also, municipalities that have stories about other companies that did a really poor job. So in that case, if someone calls you and says, hey, I noticed that company A did work in your city, what can you tell me about them? The recommendation on what you can and should say is to stick to the facts. Don't let your personal feelings get involved there. Don't say, things that cannot be proven. Did they go over budget? Great, you could say that. Did they, how many change orders did they have? Why they had the change orders? Did they miss their deadline? Did they, those are things that are demonstrably true or false, right? Like you could say, yes, they did. No, they didn't. It's you can demonstrate and prove those things. So if it's a fact of what happened, you can stick with that, but leave all of your personal feelings and emotions aside, because if you're calling people and you're telling them all these things on why they shouldn't hire that company, you may be restricting commerce, and that could be a major problem there. Okay, so let's take that one step further then, right? We're going to call this discussion piece the Bully Association, right? And just wanted to remind everybody that this being October, it is National Bullying Prevention Month. So let's definitely stop bullying. But let's talk about an association's role here. Can an association restrict a company's ability to do business based on past performance? So can an association say, you should not use this? Let's use one of our associations that we work with, for example. Let's say it's a group of city engineers. Can they get up in their association meeting and say, hey, maybe a member says, we had a bad experience with this contractor. Nobody should use them because they're terrible. That is where we become a problem. That's using the association's pulpit for a group boycott. So that would be a problem there. So associations, that is not an appropriate use there. There's a big difference between sharing information with colleagues or friends versus using the association to restrict commerce for a business. that could be considered an antitrust violation, and it could have some pretty severe penalties there if the association is actively trying to restrict a company's ability to do business. Even sharing information with colleagues, even there, it can be a little bit dicey. Again, as I mentioned in the previous example, if someone calls and asks you about the project, sharing the facts and what's relevant to your and pertinent to your project is fine and acceptable. But going out of your way to call and take out advertisements and let people know how bad an experience you had with a company, it's bad form. It could be considered illegal, and I would just recommend that we stay away from it. So those are some examples there of what we of some real world applications and what we need to look for when we're dealing with antitrust and associations. So a couple of the takeaways that we talked about today was antitrust laws, any trade restraints, and then we talked about some of the real world applications there. For more information about this topic or any Oldcastle products discussed in the presentation, please email me at jason.allen@oldcastle.com or visit oldcastleinfrastructure.com.